Welcome to the PASS Summit 2020. My name is Russel Loski, and I will be presenting on how to consume API data using built-in SSIS components. PASS is an organization that offers many different offerings. There's free ones like SQL Saturday, virtual users group. There's local users groups. They have 24 hours of PASS. They also have paid offerings such as this summit, and they also have a year-round learning program. So check us out on pass.org. So my name is Russel Loski, and I'm a grandfather of two adorable little grandchildren. But I've been a SQL developer for more than 20 years. I started in SQL Server 6.5 and have been working with that for almost that whole time, mostly with ETL products such as DTS or SSIS. And most recently, I've been using learning Azure Data Factory. Currently, I'm a data analytics engineer for Navisite. We're a large managed service provider for cloud and for database. So check us out if you have any of those needs. Now, I've always loved to see how I could get data from different forms, and one of the things that has been biting me is, how do I get data from the internet? And so I've looked into it, and I found that there is a tool, APIs, and I've had to work through how to get to those. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about just in general what are APIs and how they work in ETL. Then we'll look at how to set up your SSIS component. This is work you'll do anytime you do a SSIS script component. Then we'll look at how to connect to the API. And finally, we'll look at how to parse the data that comes from the API. So let's look at APIs. So about a year and a half ago, we moved into our house. We're renting. And about a year ago, we get a call from our landlady wondering where our rent was. I was mortified. I hate paying things late. You see, the problem was I have been paying my mortgage and my rent using an automatic withdrawal, and we didn't have that available. And so we've now got it set to where we have a reminder that we try to keep track of. But it's like, a file. You have an ETL process that starts when somebody downloads a file. What if they forget about it, or they're on vacation, or whatever? The whole process fails. Okay, why should your ETL be stuck with something so manual, so key to the whole process? And I find that APIs are a tool that we can use. Now, APIs in general, they refer to an application programming interface. That's basically when one program needs to talk to another, they need to know, what kind of data they're requesting and how to request it, etc. When you're talking across the web, that's even more important. And there's a standard called RESTful APIs where you can send, normally it's a URL request, maybe with some decoration in the headers, and you'll get a response back. So, we're going to look at how to use those in SSIS. Now, where do you find these? Probably the easiest way is just ask your vendor. Now, if you don't get a good response, check and see online. Sometimes somebody might have an API that'll work for your vendor. We're looking at some public data, and there's a lot of public data out there, and this is specifically the NOAA weather API. So I have references at the end on how you can get this and what you need and different things you can do with it. Okay, so the tasks in processing the API, you're going to set up SSIS. And that's going to be anytime you're working with the SSIS script component. Then you're going to have to connect to the API, and we'll look at the different steps for that. And then finally, if you don't want to just dump it into a file, you're going to have to parse the results. Okay, so let's look at setting up the script component. First, we're going to look at parameterizing. You parameterize anything that changes. Then you create your source script and configure it. Configure the name, the source columns, the output columns. If there are variables, add them. And I'm going to talk about error handling because these things blow up. Okay, so let's look at setting up the component. Now I already have a script component here, but let's look at the parameters. And if you look at the parameters, you'll see that we've got a file name and a URL. This is information if I want to go to a different station. So the KDFW is local to where I'm at. I could pass in a different one. Okay, so put it into a format that can change. Now when I get to my control flow, I will add a data flow. And in the data flow, then I will go to my SSIS toolbox. And from there, I'll then drag a script component to the surface. When I do that, it gives me some choices. I can do a transformation. That's the default. That's where I get an input, and I can create one or more outputs. A source, which has no input but is going to produce one or more outputs. Destination, which has an input but is not going to output. Okay, is not normally going to output. We're going to create this as a source. And you'll notice it turns red, and there's a couple reasons for it. We have to create a script for it, but before we can do that, let's edit this. And if you go to the inputs and outputs, you'll see that there's an output 0. Okay, let me shift this down. An output 0. That's a default name. I'd change that the first thing I could to something that makes sense. You're going to see this in errors. So I'll call it API results. And if I open it up, you'll see that it has output columns. There are no columns. So then I need to add column. So I'll click on add column, and I can type in the name here. And then I have to go down to change the data type. By default, it's going to be integer. I'll create string or Unicode string. I'll make it long enough to hold everything, and then I'll add another column. And by the way, I can change the name in the drop down or here on the right, or I can do it in the hierarchical view. Okay, so I'm going to call this file data. Now I'm going to show you just briefly a different component that you can use, and it requires that you output some kind of large object data, either an image, a text, or a Unicode text. So I'm going to make it image. That does the least amount of work. Okay, then I click OK. And one thing I like to do is to exit. It won't save until you're on this surface, until you hit OK and save. So at some points you need to come back in. Okay, I'm going to make one more change to this, and this is, you'll see this in the next project. I'm going to add an export column. Export column and its counterpart import column is basically going to have a file name and of data. In the case of export, it's going to have a file name that is going to be the name of the file you're going to write to. So I put my extract column, that's where my data is, and that's going to be some kind of large object, and that's why I put it into an image. My file path, which is file name, and then I'm going to force truncate, which is this option, just to force it to overwrite what's there. You can do something else if you want. Now then, I have information. In order to run this source, I need to have the URL. So I need to pass this in as a parameter to the script component. So I go into my read-only variables, and I click on the, there's an ellipsis just to the right of the variable, and we will go down and look for these two parameters and check them. So you see over here the 3, that's where I click to get that to show. And now this will, if I hit edit script, it will then finish up. Let me show you one other thing. If you look, it has script language, and you can actually select which language you want. You can either use VB, Visual Basic, or C#. Everything I'm doing today can be done with Visual Basic. You'll use some different methodology for doing it. So eventually I hope to put this together in a Visual Basic way as well. But you have to select the language, and once you select the language, you're locked into it for this script component. Okay, let's delete this, and let's see if I can get this to work. So I've created this already, just so that you don't have to watch. Now, when I first if I were to have first clicked the edit script, it's going to do some work in the background. It's going to create code for each of the columns, methods. Okay. So anyway, when I get into this, I'm going to see these things that say public override. Okay. And what will happen is that SSIS is going to run these bits of code whenever there's whenever it's at the right place. Pre-execute is going to execute when you first start running the component. Post-execute is going to run at the end. Create new output rows is the most logical place to put this code. In fact, I think it's the only one. It gets called kind of in the middle between those two, and it will then, its purpose is to create all of the output rows. Now, I added error handling, and you've got a try, and then you got curly brackets, and those curly brackets are going to then be, that's going to be where the code goes. I'm going to put between those two curly brackets, I'm going to put my code that I'm going to use to create the output. The catch will catch the exception, and I put an EX because I want to get the variable, the exception that occurs. I'm going to do something with it. Now I have to create a variable. It's a Boolean, and assign it a value. And I'm going to create, I'll call it cancel. And then when I create my error handling, this error handling, I use this dot component metadata dot fire error. Just have to remember that. This dot component metadata fire error, and then I'll pass in a number, and that number has to be 50,000 or greater. You'll see that number in your errors. Pick one that you can, you might be able to make sense out of. Then I put, what I'm doing with this, which is to parse the data, and from there I'll then pass in the next thing is the description. What is the error message that I want to be put up there? The null is a placeholder for if I could have help desk, some kind of help file Okay, I'm putting null in there because I don't have anything. 0, that's the help context. And then I have this out. And this is, I think, similar to using out in SQL Server. So I can pass data in, but it will also return data from it. Okay, so we have that. And that's basically how we set up our component. So we parameterize, put things that change. We're going to set up the source, set up the columns, add the variables, etc. Then we'll add our error handling. So now we connect to the API. Now, connecting to the API, I think, is the first hard thing we're going to encounter, something that we don't normally encounter as a DBA. And what you're going to have to do, you're going to have to make a request, and you're going to get a response, and then you're going to have to parse send the output. Okay, so let's look at how that works. And let's go to this project where I've already set this up. And let's edit this. And what I've done, so I have my API results. I have everything here. But then I've added some additional code, and I'll explain how that code works. So what we're going to do, so the first thing I like to do is to get everything that's in a parameter, put it into just regular variables. And then, okay, so I'm in this section. And the first thing I want to do is get my global variables. So I have my username. Now, see, to get in a script component works very different than a script task. So always, this is one of the confusing parts. This is a script component. You can get to the variables that you pass in, the read, write, and the read, by just saying this.variables, and then put the name of the variable. Okay, and it's converting it to a property that you can access. So I've got my URL, my file name. I put in a user agent. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Okay, we set up our connection. We're going to use a class called HTTP web request. Okay, I think there's a couple other alternatives. This one is the one I'm comfortable with, mainly just because I've been using it. So just you can research, find out which ones are the best to use. Okay, now normally when I create an object in .NET, I'm going to have the type, and then I'm going to have the new keyword, and then I'm going to have the name of the class that I'm creating. This particular object has a create HTTP method that you can call, and it does some validation to make sure that you've got a proper URL, etc. Okay, we'll talk about this user agent in just a moment. A lot of times you will not need to have anything other than just your request, and you will then go to this step and get your response. Okay, and I'm going to get, I have an HTTP web request, I have an HTTP web response. Now the problem I have, you say I use the method, I just say go get a response. Okay, just remember that you're getting a response. Okay, the problem is that is a generic, it's going to give you just a web response. Okay, we want it to be specifically an HTTP web response. Okay, so I put in parentheses, I'm saying cast this as an HTTP web response. Okay, now we get down to here and we get what's called a memory stream. One of the things that the ways that they talk about communicating almost in all kinds of ways, between files and memory, talking from the console to, they use the concept of stream. Okay, basically a stream is you've got data that's moving in sequence, and you're taking a chunk of it, and you might take the whole thing, go from the, it's moving data. And to read it, what I have to do is I have to create a stream object in memory, and that's called a memory stream, and it's in the I put that whole thing, system.io.memory stream, to be able to get that. And I create one, and then with my response, when I want to take what comes from the web and write it to the memory, I copy it to that memory stream. Okay, so that gives me my, I'm able to get the data, so it's copying it into the memory, and now from now on I can refer to what's in memory. Now once I have the data, I have to load the data into a buffer, and so I had that I created an output called API results. It creates a class called API results buffer. Okay, that buffer, then I will be adding things to it. So in this case, I add a row to it. Okay, now you see the second line here right after where I assign a file name. 90% of the time, all you're going to do is you're going to take a value that you've got somewhere, and you're going to assign it to that column. Okay, so I've created this file name, I assign it, but then you have things like blobs. All of the large object, you can't just assign it. I can't just say ms2 array. I have to add the blob data, so I'm adding it to it rather than just assigning it. Okay, now if I were to leave this off, I get an error, and that error looks like this. It says the remote server returned an error 403 forbidden. Okay, now the reason I picked this was because it needed a header, and what I found, actually just doing a search, what I found is that this error is known, and I have to add a user agent header in my response. Okay, so now the first approach I took was there's a headers collection. Okay, now when I add something to a collection, I'll just have the collection, so request.headers, and I'll add, and then usually have some kind of a name value pair. So I add user agent, and the value I put in is the user agent, right? Okay, I thought that would work. And that works for some of the web methods, but what it says here, the user agent header has to be modified using the appropriate property or method. The problem is that there are certain properties that correspond to these standard headers, and you have to use them. User agent, there's an accept which you can use to tell it how to, give it some suggestions on what format you want the data. There's several others that are listed. Okay, so I went in and made that change, and I put the user request agent, and it'll work. So first thing I do is I go to the build, and I do a build. Do this before you leave. This will show up in the bottom left. It'll say build started, and then when it succeeds, it'll say build succeeded down in the lower left hand corner. Okay, so just be aware of that, and it's best to just do that automatically, and always hit OK. Don't hit the X, don't hit the cancel, hit OK, and then save. Okay, and we can run this. So we'll execute. This is V1. And it should run. And I've got an old version of the file. Okay. And it should create a new version of that. Okay, so let's verify that we have the right version. No, it didn't. Not sure why it didn't go away. Okay, let me see. Where did we write that file to? I think I know what happened. Okay, DFW. Okay. So let's open the file. It's always funny when things don't work the way you think they are. I must not have configured the, I think I know what I did. Oh well. Yeah, I forgot to put my, configure that. Okay. So let's run this again. Have to have one glitch, right? Okay, so we go check, and it says it's overwritten it, and now I have the newer file. Okay, and we'll look at this file in just a moment. Okay, so that's basically how I created this. Okay. So, okay, by the way, the API key will work for some. You can use headers. So there's an attached project that has a headers and adds it. Okay. So the things to connect to the API, you do a request, a response, and then an output. Okay. Now parsing the data. Okay, I've dumped it to a file, and maybe for most cases that's good enough. Okay, but let's see if we can do a little bit better. Okay, so parsing the data, we're going to be getting what's called JSON, and we'll talk about what JSON is in just a moment. And then we're going to write to the columns. Okay, so the things we'll be doing is we'll convert the structured data to columns. And then we'll read to do that, we're going to read JSON text into memory, and we'll look at some of the common errors with that, and then we'll write to the output. So JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. It's very similar to XML, except for it's lighter. Basically, you've got an object that, if you look at it with the thinking of object-oriented, you can see the objects there. Okay, now what we've got are in curly braces. You've got a whole object, and it's got an ID is the one of the properties of that, and that has the value test. It also has a value, which is also a complex object. Okay, that complex object has a name. Property, Russ, has a certification property, MCSD. Okay, so the idea, you can see the structure, and JavaScript will read this very nicely. Python, various other languages will read that. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to deserialize it, and basically serialization is you're converting memory into bytes that you can pass on to another program. In the case of something on the web, you're converting it to text that can be sent across the web, and that you can then reconstruct using deserialization into an object. Okay, So deserialization, there's different tools you can use. Newtonsoft JSON.net, you will see this referred to often. This is probably the gold standard for working with JSON in .NET. Okay, and it's free. I'll talk about the issues in just a moment. System.text.json is another library, a free library that you can use. Okay, I haven't looked at JavaScript serializer at all, but that's another library that you could use. The one we're going to use is data contract JSON serializer. Now, if you have worked with JSON much, and you are willing to put up with the challenges of adding a custom object, custom code to your SSIS solution, and that's in development and in deployment. Okay, if you're ready to work with that, this is a good solution. And now the one thing you've got to do, you've got to make sure you keep it updated on the server as well as in your you've got to keep them in sync, etc. So there's some challenges with that, but it's a perfectly good solution if you are comfortable doing that. Data contract JSON serializer is out of the box. When you install .NET on your computer, it's there. We'll have to do a little bit of work, but we don't have to maintain the deployment. We don't have to keep it updated. Okay. So the idea of a serialization is we've got a class that we're going to create that's going to match the structure of our JSON. So we've got the JSON on the left. We create a class. That class can have any name that you want, and all you have to do is decorate it with data contract. Okay. So you decorate it and say, put in square brackets before the class data contract, and it will be able to recognize that this is something that needs to be parsed with JSON. Now, every property that you want to be treated as JSON, you have to put the keywords data method before it in square bracket. Okay. Now the two lines after data method where it says public string ID and then the curly braces and get and set, that's a notation for C# for creating properties. You have to do it a little bit differently in VB.NET. Okay, when you get down to the value, you're going to create another class, C2, and it's going to have its structure. Okay, that name C2 can be anything. Now, value, ID, those names are important. Okay, you have to get those right, or else you're going to have to adjust some things to make it work right. Okay, so what could go wrong? The first thing is you may not be able to parse the text. Okay, and a lot of that occurs because you misspell the property. So you've got ID and you put something else, identifier. Okay, they're not the same. It can't identify. What's hardest is that I could have capital ID in my JSON and put lowercase ID in my class, and it won't work. Okay, so I have to get these right. Another thing I've done is I leave out the data method. Okay, and that causes it to blow out. The one that's hardest to work with is null numbers. Numbers in .NET, integers, decimals, float, as well as dates cannot be null. So what you have to do is you have to create what's called a nullable decimal, a nullable integer, a nullable date. Okay, and we'll show you how to do that. And finally, invalid data type. We will have a date, and it looks perfectly fine, but the problem is that JSON can't interpret it as a date. Okay. Now on the other side, when we write to the output, there's some problems. Handling the nullable variables is a problem. You have to, once you've made a decimal nullable, you have to use other approaches to get the data out of it. And then we will look at how to convert the date time. So let's look at parsing the data. And I've created this project, and it has errors in it. And we will go through and correct those errors. So this is what I created with this. And let's look at each of these. And we'll look at the structure of the document as well as this. Okay, so let's start with observation. And what you'll find is that I'm treating this whole thing as being an observation. Okay, it has some things at the beginning that I'm going to ignore, the context, but then you'll see I have an ID, and I will have an ID in this as well. I have a type. Okay, now I have properties. Okay, so then I will treat those properties like station, timestamp, each with their types, text description. I'll put icon into it. You see I've got temperature. That's a complex item. I've put, I've split up temperature value, temperature unit code, and temperature quality. Each of those I'll put into their own. Now when I get way down to the bottom here, you'll see something a little bit different. See where it says cloud layers? There's a square bracket right after cloud layers. A square bracket is used to indicate an array in Java, in JSON. Okay, and so what I did is I moved that up to here. I created cloud layers, so there'll be one row for each cloud layer. I mean, I ran this 2 days ago, and I had multiple cloud layers. Okay. So that's that. And then we come into here. Okay. There's going to be several errors here, and we'll fix them. The first one, we have the component that we're going to use is not loaded by default by SSIS. Okay, it's installed, it's just not loaded. And so what we do is we come over to Solution Explorer, and you see the keyword reference. References, okay? And we right-click that, and we add the reference. And then we look for system.runtime.serialization. Okay, and we check that. And then we go to the bottom. And we hit OK. Now I'm going to do something that I could have done with the system.net and the system.io. I decided not to. This region namespaces, these are namespaces that are used in this document. But the idea is that if I put it up here, I don't have to type the whole thing out. And so what I want to do here is I'll put system.runtime.serialization, and that means I don't have to type this out every time. So I can refer to them using a shorthand. And I'll do this as well for my JSON serialization. Okay. Now the flow then of this, the one thing I do is I set my position to 0. So it's probably good practice to set it. So I copy from my response stream, copy it to memory, and then I'm reading it using that add blob data. Now I want to set it back to the beginning so that I can reread it, because streams have, they're flowing. Okay. Then I'll create an object, and its type is going to be NOAA observations, and I'll show you how we create that in just a moment. Okay, and then I'm making it a new. I'm not sure if this is necessary, but it makes this code readable. This will work only if you have the new. Then I initialize the deserializer, and I'm actually creating a data contract JSON serializer. That's going to be the code that behind the scenes is going to figure out how to parse that the data, the string. And I create it as a new, and I pass in the type. I'm saying use this type and get the information from there, that type, to figure out how to handle this. Okay, and then I do a JSON.read object and then pass in that stream. It'll read the stream and try to parse it as a NOAA observations. Now I put the as NOAA observations. That's a different way to cast. The one advantage to this is if it fails, it makes it a null. Okay, so if it doesn't recognize the document as a NOAA observations, it will do that. So then first thing I want to do is to test to see, is it null? So if not equal null, then we're going to do this. And I just add my row and then just go through, and for each of these I'm going to then read them. Okay, so these are the normal ways, and we'll look at what's wrong in just a moment. Okay, so, and there's a problem down here as well. Okay, so what I'm doing, I put my data contract. That tells the JSON parser that this is something that I can understand as something I can parse. And it's going to be, and let's see, public, and I'll hit escape. And then put a class, and you could call this whatever you want. This name really doesn't affect how the parsing works. What it affects is whether you can understand it. So you see down below I have NOAA observation, but let's just call it Peach for now. What I have to get right is the names of the of each of the properties of this. So let's call this a data member, and we'll call it do a public, and we'll just make this a string, and this has to be uppercase because if my document is uppercase. If it were lowercase, it would have to be lowercase. Then I put get and set. For my value, it's very similar. I put data member, and we'll call this C, and it doesn't like it until if you don't have it yet, C, and we'll call this a value, and you'd have a get and a set as well. And that's how you would create this. Okay, let's delete this so that it doesn't mess things up. Okay, now so I've started building this, and you see my observations. I have ID, and I have a geometry. And you look at the geometry, it has a type, and it has a this is an array of decimals. So if I go all the way up to the top, you can see our geometry. So it's got a type. It's got a type and a coordinates property. The coordinates is a decimal coordinates. Okay. Then I have a properties, and again it has to be uppercase or lowercase properties. Okay, so now I go down to my properties. And so let's look at this one and see if you can tell what's wrong with that. Okay, the problem with this is that I have an uppercase and this needs to be lowercase. So I can change this. There is another method I could have used. I can put name. Let's see, sorry. I can put name equals station. This will also parse this. Okay. It's not required if if I have the name spelled right. Okay. The second one, I won't spend a lot of time. The problem is that when it parses this, JSON cannot interpret this as a timestamp or as a date time offset. Date time offset is basically a date time with the its relationship to universal time. So what I have to do is make this into a string, but this is going to cause some things to blow up there. Okay, now what's wrong with this one? Okay, the problem with this one is it needs a data method or data member. Sorry, I always say method. Okay. So I have to have a data method. Okay. Now we're going to look at min temperature last 24 hours in just a moment. Okay. So all of these, by the way, they have the same pattern. The temperature, the min temperature, last 24 hours, the gust, the direction, everything has the same structure. It's basically, you've got a unit code, a quality control, and a value. And so you'll see it over and over again. So I keep reusing it. The problem is this. As soon as it finds that null value, it stops. It just quits processing, so you get nothing. Okay. Now, there's a couple ways that we can handle it, but the generic way is to make this nullable, and to make it nullable, I just put a question mark. The question mark makes it nullable. Okay, so I put a question mark after it, and it makes it nullable. So we will, that fixes that problem. It will parse. We'll see some errors that occur because of that. This one, base is an internal C# keyword that you can't use. I tried different things, square brackets, or I tried different things. I could not get it to work. So what I had to do, I was forced to put something like cloud base. So then if I put cloud base, how is it going to recognize that this is a base? Okay, so I put into parentheses, I put name, and spell it right, base, and it will then read the base. Okay. This, I believe, fixes all of the errors down here, but then it causes things to mess up here. Okay, the first thing, what's wrong here? And it's basically I have to make this a lowercase. Okay, the problem with this is I can't assign to a, this is a date time offset. I can't assign that a timestamp value. And what I have to do is I have to parse it. I have to use a method called date time offset dot parse exact. Okay, I'll put my parentheses in my parentheses here. Pass in a string, and now I'm going to tell it how to parse it. And I've done this. I'll probably, hopefully, get it right the first time. So I type in. It gives me a little bit of help. This is, I think, cool. This gives me a 4-digit year. And then I want month. Okay, yeah, 2-digit month. And then I'll type in DD for day. And then T is a constant. And then HH. Okay, it's not going to recognize this anymore after that T. So I put HH colon MM colon and SS, and then one last thing, the capital K, which is used, that's used for that plus or minus number to indicate what its relationship to UTC, Universal Time, is. Okay, so I'll do one other argument. I have to tell it what culture I'm using. Am I using a US? Am I using, what culture am I using? And to do that, I do use a system, and it helps. Sometimes that works. And put a globalization dot and culture info dot invariant culture, and that basically is saying just use kind of a don't look at the culture, just use use the numbers there. Okay, when I get to here, you see that it doesn't like our value. What I have to do is I have to put value, the property. Now the problem with doing that just by itself is that it sometimes it doesn't have a value. And so what you have to do is to test if, and I copy this whole thing and paste it in here and put has value, and we'll put that into our parentheses or into our curly braces. Okay, so it's decided to do something. So I'm going to do this with my, okay, it's in. Okay. And I'll do that with my min temperature. By the way, just to make it easier to read, I'll put this here. So I put dot value. And what I'll do is test to see if it has a value. And we test, has value. And we'll put this at the end of this. Okay. And those are fine. And we'll do the same with this, dot value. Oh, first thing we have to do is we have to name this cloud base. And we'll put the value here, and then we'll copy and test to make sure that we have a value. And by the way, while I'm typing this, you might also decide, why bother putting the rest of the properties in, if it's not, if they're not valid. Let's see, and this is, we'll put cloud base here. This should compile. So we'll do build. I always get build and compile. It succeeded. So we get down to the bottom. It succeeded. Okay. Then what I'll do, and this is the, so it succeeded, and then we, this is the final. I'm actually writing everything from this into it, so I've built the whole thing out, and I start this and run this, and you'll see the all of the values in this. Okay, I have one last project that I've put in, and I'll show it to you. I won't go through. It required a little change, so I changed the URL. I had to look at the structure of the document and found that it was a little bit different, and so then I went and I built this. Observations is going to get all of the, oops, it helps to stop the old run. So we'll execute the package. Okay, and you can see it gets, I forget how many, but it gets a ton of results from here. These are going back several days. Okay, so you can take a look at that and see, and then you can see the cloud base. Okay. So that's parsing the data. You're going to configure the class, you're going to load the output, and then you're going to parse the data, creating class, setting up deserialization, and watching for errors. Okay, I have some references. If you're interested in the NOAA APIs, the first two are about the API that I worked with. If you want, you can look at the bottom one, and they provide other APIs. This is a list of public APIs. Then I have an intro to APIs, and here's some, for .NET, the how to format and the JSON serialization. The one takeaway I'd have is just that you just need a few skills to work with this. Learn how to set up your SSIS component. Learn how to connect to a web API. You don't have to just quit on it. Don't say, oh, this is too much. So just very simple things, you can get a lot of information out of your APIs. So thank you. Oops. I always get to the wrong place. We have to take one last look at that. Be sure and fill out the evaluation. They're due before Friday. And if you fill them out, you have a chance of getting a prize. And thank you very much. And if you have any questions, write me at the address below. Sometimes I'll listen to Twitter. So thank you very much, and have a great conference.